didn't know I was going to be quickly losing weight when I went to quit time. So, we're going to do a review today. We're going to go through a whole slew of problems. Your test is on Wednesday. I describe these things as short answer. You may think they're long answer or essays. They basically draw a graph and do stuff with the graphs. That's most of your test. And we'll run through a lot of examples of that as we move along today. A couple other things. When you're, if I don't remember this on Wednesday, you should finish reading the rest of chapter 6 and start reading chapter 9 on Friday. Actually, on Thursday morning, I'm giving a talk at the Seattle Alumni Association on the Seattle minimum wage. And I figure it's as good a time as any to give it to you too, with a little more of the intricacies of the demand and supply curve. So that's what we're going to do on Friday. So there is a section in chapter 6 on the minimum wage. So, I think, yes, there is. I can't remember if there's a section or a problem, but in any case, we'll be going through it. Okay. So your test is basically demand and supply analysis. So this is sort of the first third of what you get out of this course is here's the fundamental pieces that we're going to do analysis with. So we're going to be dealing with demand and the components of demand, the things that cause demand, movement along the demand curve, and the things that cause shifts in demand curves. We're going to do the same thing with supply. We're going to look at gains from trade, which are consumer surplus and producer surplus. And then we'll move into elasticity and taxation. Before I start doing problems, does anybody have specific questions? Is there stuff you want to go over in particular? Yes?
Are we doing price ceilings or price floors or anything?
We're not doing price ceilings or price floors yet. Minimum wage is actually a price floor, so that's what we're moving into on Friday. But you are responsible for the taxation part of that chapter, and chapter 8, which is also taxation. Any other questions? Okay. We'll start with. Okay, I'm going to do, you have about 20 problems in the book that we assigned at some point. We're going to go through all those. And then I also did some not handouts, but some postings on campus. And we will also go through some of those as well. But I just want to walk through each of these pretty slowly. Let me start. Okay, I'm on page 86 in the text review. We will not have multiple choice questions on the test, although we may go over a few. So, starting at number 1 on page 86, the change in which of the following will not shift the demand curve for hot hamburgers. Price of hot dogs. What does the price of hot dogs do to the demand curve for hamburgers? What are hamburgers and hot dogs? So if the price changes, what happens to the demand curve for hamburgers? Shifting or moving along the curve? Shifting the curve. So they're substitutes. Changing the price of the substitute is going to shift. And, as you pointed out, here's the demand curve for, what are we looking at? Hamburgers or hot dogs? So these are hamburgers. So if the price of hot dogs goes up, what happens to the demand curve for hamburgers? It shifts out. How much does it shift out? Do you actually know?
No.
What would determine how much it's shifted out? And what about elasticity? What characteristic of elasticity? So if you look at cross-price elasticity, okay? So if you look at price elasticity between goods X and Y, and you say they're substitutes, the larger that number, in other words, the bigger the substitute is, or excuse me, the bigger the cross elasticity is, it tells you what about those substitutes. So if it's a really tiny number, are they very good substitutes? No. So the larger the elasticity, the cross-price elasticity, the bigger the shift. So if these things, so for some people, it may be a big shift. For other people, it may be a little shift. But cross-price elasticity is simply measuring the size of that shift all the time. And likewise, if the price of hot dogs were to go down, you'd substitute away from hamburgers. It may be a little if they're not close substitutes. If they are close substitutes, it would be a lot. So again, we're just measuring the size of that shift each time. What about a change in the price for hamburgers? What does that do to the demand curve for hamburgers? Nothing. You're moving along the demand curve. Okay, make sure you get that piece in. So any change in the price of hamburgers, if this is our actual curve here, the change in the price of hamburgers is going to have to occur because there's a change in supply. We're going to have a new market equilibrium. That's all we're going to see. Price of hamburger buns. What are hamburger buns to hamburgers? The complements. So what's hamburger bun prices change remarkably? What's going to happen to the demand curve for hamburgers? It's going to shift. Okay? And again, it's going to be the opposite of the substitute effect. The complement effect is if the price of hamburger buns goes down, the demand for hamburgers will go up. It's because you're buying them together, essentially. Okay, the income for hamburger. The income of hamburger consumers. My glasses like the income of hamburgers. So what do you have to decide when you're looking at the income effect? If you're going to see how it's going to affect the demand curve, yes.
Whether it's normal or inferior good.
Yeah, you need to look at this and go, well, for a certain class of people, this is a normal good. So if incomes go up over a certain range, demand's going to do what? If it's normal, what will it do? It will shift out. So here is the demand curve with incomes of $20,000 a year, and here's the demand curve with incomes of $25,000 a year. That's assuming it's a normal good. Now, maybe, or maybe quite likely, here's the demand curve for people with incomes, when their incomes change to 1, 2, 3, 4, $100,000 a year. So at some point that good may become an inferior good. Demand curve shifts E. Okay, question 3. Movie tickets and DVDs are substitutes. If the price of DVDs increases, what happens to the market for movie tickets? Okay, if the price of DVDs increases, what happens in the market for movie tickets? So let's start with, now to be able to do these fast now. There's a demand curve, here's a supply curve, here's the market of movie tickets. So as a reference point, and this is true for what you're doing today, and what you're doing on Wednesday, and what you're going to be doing when you're looking at public policy in general, this is your starting point. Your start off with some equilibrium quantity and some equilibrium price. And when you're doing these problems, including your test, label stuff. So it's the market for movie tickets, you've got a supply curve, you've got a demand curve, you've got Q, E, and P, dollars on this axis, and quantity per unit of time on that axis. That's your standard, that's the 90% of economic analysis is done using this as the starting point. Okay, what happens to the market for movie tickets? Where is this? If the price of the DVD increases, what happens in the market for movie tickets? Does the supply curve shift to the left? No. So supply is not affected. We're assuming that these things are substitutes, so there are no supply effects here. So we're going to maintain the same supply curve. What's going to happen? Demand's going to do what?
Shift to the right.
What do we increase this or decrease it? Yeah. So that's with, this is with DVDs at $4 a piece, and this is with DVDs at $6 a piece. That's all we're saying when these things shift with substitutes. Again, the size of this shift is going to be determined by how close the substitutes these things actually are. So if they're not close substitutes, there's going to be a tiny shift. If they are really big substitutes, you're going to see a big shift. You can sort of, you can think of this in terms of candies as good, or pop is as good an example as any. You think of Coca-Cola and root beer and 7-Up and ginger ale as substitutes for each other. And they are pretty close substitutes for each other. If the price of Coca-Cola doubles, you switch away from that and start drinking root beer, unless you're a Coke addict or Pepsi addict. And some people are. If the price of all soda pop changes, there's a different demand curve and a different sort of shift occurring because the substitutions are different. So it's how close the substitutes are will determine the overall effect. Okay, the discovery of a large new reserve of crude oil, this is number 4, will do what to the, what curve leading to what in the equilibrium price. Okay, so here's the market for oil, and this is exactly what we've seen happen. Let's see, Arborine. Here are today's prices of gasoline driving down Madison Avenue, or up Madison Avenue towards SU and going all the way to Costco. At some point, we need to start talking about information, but you can see how different these prices. I don't have an explanation for this. At least I don't for the 349. It was 183 in Stanley on Sunday. So, whole new world of the gasoline business. So here's oil, here's dollars, here's quantity per unit of time, equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price. And there's a discovery of a new oil, or a new way to get oil out of the ground, fracking. What happens in this market?
Supply increase.
And change in technology. Here's technology 1, here's technology 2. The equilibrium price falls, and the equilibrium quantity increases. Everything that we're seeing in the oil markets right now is basically similar to there's some supply change that occurring. There are demand changes occurring. The major pieces are supply changes that are going on. Yes, sir.
I just have a question about the gas. People are stockpiling gas right now, so won't, in the long run, the gas market take a hit? Because people realize, hey, when the price goes back up, nobody's going to need it.
Say that again.
People are stockpiling on gas right now, so when the price goes up, nobody's going to need it. So won't the oil market in the long run take a hit?
It may take a short run hit. It probably won't take a long run hit. So my guess is, the United States has a strategic oil reserve, and they're probably filling the thing up like crazy right now. But they'll hold off feeding that out once prices change. A lot of these things are done just through futures markets, so the actual physical amount doesn't change. Prices get set by futures markets. So it's a more difficult question than just saying, they'll take a hit or they won't take a hit. So some of the airlines, for instance, have already bought their airline fuel out 3 years. And a lot of them are screwed for doing it. Because a lot of them bought it at twice what they could have paid for it now. Others held off. And Southwest Airlines made a bundle 2 or 3 or 4 years ago because they bought oil futures, or basically fuel futures, that allowed them to not take a big hit when oil prices went really high. So if you look at their particular stock price, it stays really steady while all the other airlines are dropping. The other airlines were dropping because their oil prices their fuel prices were high. Of course, that's switched now. But a lot of that stuff is taken care of through futures markets themselves. Okay. Grab a person you want to work with and come up here and take one of these things. Come on, get up. You're off your duck. I'm done with So, if you start to fill up, you're not all going to fit on the board. You can grab these things, they stick on the wall. If you want to take it with you, draw small. We got 6 of these. Yeah, take one of these. Some of you can come to the board if you want to come to the board. If you want to keep stuff, you can.
Ken, do you want to do the board? All right. I had one today already.
Oh, that's nice.
I think I have another one.
I was thinking about the same group here. Maybe easier to.
Come on. You've done this.
You're going to sign this.
Yeah, sometimes that really good. And they have they lose their
I think so.
Okay. Those of you that have paper, try to keep the graphs relatively small because you're going to get the second piece of the paper fast otherwise. Okay. Okay, do this graphically. Explain why when a cold snap hits Florida, the price of orange juice rises in supermarkets throughout the country.
Wow, there's on
Yeah, that was good. Yeah.
Supply one,
So it was, I think, supply would be. So yeah, so it was basically, when there's a close now, what is the price? Okay, because the demand doesn't, I don't think it goes up.
Sorry, the supply, that's what I meant.
Yeah, supply,
this is the
so what happens?
no, sorry, that means left. Oh, you're right, which would make sense.
It's really what happens?
Yeah. I think that.
Okay, what happens to the price of oranges? Okay, it goes up. So you should have a new equilibrium price and quantity. Now here's a trickier question, depending on how you drew this. Okay? Are consumers better off or worse off? Price went up, consumer surplus went down, so that triangle actually went down. So are producers necessarily worse off? Why not? So you go, I know that's a trick question, so I'm going to shake my head. The question is why? So what do you have to know about producers? So if the price went up, right? The price has gone up and there's been a shift in supply. Okay? So forget about your graphs for a second, just think in your head. So suppose that the price goes up 20% and the decrease in quantity only goes down 10%. What happens to total revenue for the suppliers? It goes up. So it's possible, depending on where you are in the marketplace, that the suppliers could go, oh, this is great. I'm sure that there are people all over the world that might have little votive candle altars praying for freezes and orange juice and coffee and things like that because they buy orange juice features. You know, they're praying for stuff like this. Okay. So what you should have here is you should have a shift back in supply. You should have a higher equilibrium price. And you should have lower equilibrium quantity. Okay, so consumer surplus should be lower. We're not sure about producer surplus. It depends on how you drew it. Okay. When the weather turns warm in New England every summer, the price of hotel rooms in Caribbean resorts plummets. So we're looking at the market for hotel rooms in the Caribbean. So do an equilibrium price and quantity.
But it's just the price. Only the price has changed. Was he only talking about one place? Just the Caribbean. Then it's supposed to shift along the curve. The price.
Okay, I'm going to stop you for a second, just to make sure we're all on the same page here. The first part of these things should take you no more than 2 seconds. In other words, for every one of these things, you're always starting from the exact same point. There's just a demand and supply curve, and you have equilibrium price and quantity. So that piece of it you should always have immediately. Okay. Then the next question you go is, well, I'm looking at hotel rooms in the Caribbean, and all of a sudden it got warm in New England, so people are staying in New England because the beaches don't look so horrific. They do today, they don't most other days. What happens is the demand for, what are those two things? They're substitutes somewhere. So if there's the demand for the beaches up in wherever we are, New England's gone up, so the demand for these beaches is going to go down. So you should have a downward shift in demand. What happens to price? It's going to go down, quantity sold is actually going to go down. Which is why you get all these great deals in the summertime. In Cabo, same thing. Better fishing than when a war breaks out in the Middle East, the price of gasoline rises and the price of a used Cadillac falls. So you ought to be able to explain that using diagrams. So start with, here we have two markets. You've got the gasoline market, and you have the Cadillac market. So those are your two markets. And what happens when war breaks out in the Middle East? Make an assumption. Oil prices go up. Oil prices go up. So what happens to the price of gasoline? It's going to go up, so you're going to see the supply curve shift back.
And there's more sort of price, so then there would be a shift in
What happens? What happens in the market? What happens in the market for Cadillacs? What is gas? The gasoline prices are rising. What are gasoline in Cadillacs? They're complements. And the price of complements going up. What's happening to the demand for Cadillacs? It's going down. The demand curve shifting in. What happens to the price of Cadillacs? It goes down. The new equilibrium price and quantity is down and down. You guys get that? You guys got that? Did you get that okay?
Look at their.
Yesterday.
Consider the markets in many exams. For each of the events listed here, identify which of the determinants of demand and supply are affected, and indicate whether demand and supply increases or decreases in draw a diagram. Okay, so you got a market for minivans. So get an equilibrium price and quantity instantaneously. This takes you 2 seconds. We're going to have speed drills. Equilibrium here. Okay, what happens if people decide to have more children? Demand goes up. What happens to price and quantity of minivans? Let's see what happens. So you now have, there are people decide to have more kids. So what happens to the overall demand for minivans? It goes up. So quantity and price. Everybody get that? Okay? Yes, sir?
Yeah, this is elements of representation.
Yeah.
Strike by steel workers closes down steel plants. What happens to the market for minivans? What is steel in the production of
I mean, you basically make quantity the same, like, at least.
So assume that the price of steel rises.
So the price for
If the price of steel rises, what happens to the supply of minivans? If the price of an input rises, what happens to supply? Shifts back.
Yeah.
Up.
So that's the price of higher.
Tiny minivan.
What happens to the volume goes down, price goes up.
Space Lord. So we
Yeah,
can
it's
how would the future?
Exactly. Yeah, like that. And if you miss,
Yeah, it's like, okay.
All right, Evan, you gotta draw now. I draw some
Okay, reach somewhere on your piece of paper or on the board. Write the little notation for demand is equal to a function of what? Just do that little thing I've written up there 20 times. Demand equals
Oh, okay. I thought it was nice.
a function of what thing? Wish you was
Something goes here equals something, line, stuff. That's all I know. That was close.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay, look up here a second. Everything you're doing on these graphs is coming right from this.
Yeah.
This is the demand for good X. It's moving along the curve. It was the price of X itself. And all these other things cause shifts. That's all we're doing here. On the demand, when you see a problem like this, you say to yourself, does this affect demand or supply or nothing? If it affects demand, you want to see, well, how does it, which one of these things is it affecting? Is it a substitute, is it a complement, or is it an income question, tastes or expectations? And likewise, the supply of good X is a function of the price of the good itself, price of inputs, technology, price of alternative goods, and same thing. If you think if you're looking at steel, steel is a what in the automobile industry? It's an input. So we're in the supply area. And these things, okay, so these are shifts, and these are shifts. That's all you're doing. So, for instance, I'll give, okay, put up market for corn. Just quick, this is another one of these quickies. Equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, you got the market. So, I'm going to listen up for a second, because otherwise we'll confuse things a lot. We're going to assume right now, just for our own sake, that the price of wheat, or excuse me, wheat and corn are not substitutes. Let's say. So we're dealing with gluten-free stuff. There we go. They're not, we're in a market where it's gluten-free world. Okay, so we're not on the demand side at all. But all I'm going to tell you what market we're in. We're in corn. So what happens, and just think in terms of how farmers think. All of a sudden, the price of wheat goes from $4 a bushel to $9 a bushel. What's going to happen to the amount of corn they plant next year? So keep in mind what's going on here. So you're now planting corn in, you could plant, let's assume that you can plant corn and wheat in the same fields, right? And you now have an equilibrium amount of corn that you're producing, but all of a sudden the price of wheat goes through the roof. And you're a farmer, you're sitting there going, what do I want to be planting next year? I want to be planting wheat. It's an alternative output. So you take your fields, and instead of planting corn, you're planting wheat, so the supply curve of wheat moves back. You didn't get this corn, sorry. Let's go do it.
They're gonna plant more.
Oh, yeah, they're gonna plant more, so then it must start. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because
Okay, so we've got all these farmers out there, look out. And they're producing this much wheat, and they're selling it for this many dollars. And that's under the assumption that the price of wheat, which they also could be producing, is $3.27 a bushel. Okay, now you have to think this, you have to take yourself out of the demand equation here and look at the supply side. If the farmer all of a sudden sees, okay, wheat prices have gone up to $9 a bushel, what's he going to do with the land that he's now producing corn on? He's going to start producing wheat, so unless they pay him more. So the supply curve for corn is going to shift back. And the price of corn will go up, and the quantity of corn will go down. So, I mean, this one's a little more obscure than the other ones, but if you have alternative production, things you can produce alternatively, you look at the value of those things. You decide, do I produce this or do I produce that? People do this all the time with all sorts of stuff. They produce the highest value things and the markets change. So this thing here, if you can't read my handwriting. So if the price of the alternative goes up, the supply goes down, shifts down. That's the general rule. And you just have to think in your head, how's the farmer going to respond to this? Agricultural goods are the easiest ones to look at here.
So is the only difference between a substitute and alternative is that one's for demand and one's for supply?
Yes.
So it's like the same, but just different terms.
You have to think of them in terms of what they're doing. The supplier is trying to make money. The demander is trying to consume, so there are different responses to that. over the past, okay, do a, okay, draw 3 little markets. Over the past 30 years, technological advances have reduced the cost of computer chips. How's that affected the market for computers? So one of those markets is the computer market. So computer chips are what in the production of computers? What else are they? They're both, right? It's technological change or an input. So if the price of an input is falling, what happens to the supply curve? It shifts out. So in that particular market, it's causing a downward pressure on the price of computers, right? Go ahead and draw it in here. And the quantity of computers is going to go up. Shift the supply curve. Yep. So your equilibrium price goes down and your equilibrium quantity goes up. Everybody see that? So the next market that you're looking at is the market for some computer software. What happens if there are more computers out there? Demand for computer software is going to go up, right? And you see this happen. This is what we've seen in the last 10 years. I mean, the iPhone's only 10 years old. And it's driving a huge industry. Same sort of phenomenon that's driving. What is that? What happens to the market for typewriters?
Yeah, dotted 0.
Like the hipster market.
Will the supply go down too?
So here's a curiosity. You sort of laugh when I say typewriter. How many of you have ever used a typewriter? Has anybody, how many of you have never used a typewriter? Yeah. How many of you have never used a payphone? See, some people put this on the I mean, the obsolescence is occurring.
Yeah.
So this is just how the
Yeah, that's how I got my allowance if I grow.
Yeah, exactly.
Don't put your phone in your ear. You know, people call you, oh, we're back, it's up.
Okay, listen up a second. I just got a good question. So, when we do these, we're looking at one change at a time. So, if we have the demand curve for whatever, demand curve for bagels and the price of cream cheese falls to 0. We'll assume that confidence. And all of a sudden there's a big shift in the demand for bagels. But it's a movement along the supply curve. Two things are occurring. One is a shift. That's the shift in the demand curve causes a change in the price of a complement. So you're always, first of all, looking at, is this causing a shift somewhere? So you're always going to have one of these curves shifting. And without looking at anything else, you don't have to change anything else, you're going to move along the other curve. You're not shifting it to get to that new, you only have to shift one curve to get a new equilibrium price and quantity. Does So keep that in mind. You're not shifting both of these at once, yes.
When you're saying moving along, you're saying that because the demand goes, then you already know the point that you're moving along to because wherever it intersects.
What I mean is, okay, look at this one, yeah. So you started here,
Yeah.
right? You shifted out the supply curve, then you moved along this curve.
What if there's a double shift in supply and demand?
Then you have two things happening. Then you do have to shift.
And then
Let's see where you have that.
what about like, how do you know if it's just like a move along or what is just like a move along? Is that?
Well, in order to have a move along, you have to have some shift. It may just be that we go ahead and say the price of something went up. That means you moved along the curve, but you had to have something that shifted. There has to be some change in that marketplace. So all these changes in marketplaces are going to occur because some shift is occurring. And in fact, market dynamics are such, these curves are constantly changing. And actually, we make up the idea of curves. It's just that the market dynamics are constantly changing. We're constantly having these things go on and on. For Wednesday, memorize that. Just, walk into the test. I'm going to make you memorize them, not going to like that cheat sheet. Walk into the test, take your piece of paper out, and write those two things down. And then you can work from there. That's the way to do these things. If you understand that, if you understand those two lines of argument, you can figure out what's going on in all these great questions. And all this stuff just extends to the elasticity and the tax questions that we get to in a bit. They're all coming off these two equations. And they should be in your notes somewhere. Otherwise, take your iPhone and take a picture of it. Okay. Let's see. Okay, we're back to the orange market. Okay, so let's go equilibrium price and quantity of oranges. Have you all seen trading places? Orange futures market. I think that's why economists always have orange problems. There's finally a movie about supply and demand. That was it. So, okay, here's the orange market. Okay, I'm going to read this whole thing. So let me just read it, and then we'll go through it one at a time, because this gets to your question of multiple shifts. Scientists reveal that eating oranges decreases the risk of diabetes. And at the same time, farmers use a new fertilizer that makes orange trees produce more oranges. Okay, so we want to see what happens in the marketplace. So if all of a sudden doctors say that you get less diabetes if you drink orange juice, what happens to the demand for oranges? It goes out. Now that by itself gives you what to the price and quantity? Look at that. So what would happen if that's all we were doing, just that one change? So if we just had an increase in demand, what would happen to the price? Price would go up, quantity would go up as well, right? So there's the demand increase. So now we have the second effect that farmers figure out that they have a new fertilizer that greatly increases the output of oranges. What does that do? Change in technology. What's it do to the supply curve? Shifts it out. And that shift causes what? It causes downward pressure on the price and also causes an increase in the quantity. So you don't know. So you don't know what the overall effect is. You know this. You know there's going to be an increase in quantity produced and consumed. Because all the shifts have pushed out. All the shifts have pushed out the quantity. But one of the shifts has pushed up the demand. So that price has been upward pressure on price. The other shift has caused downward pressure on price. And you actually have to know the relative differences to know what the effect on price would be. And you don't know that until you go measure it. But you unambiguously can see there are going to be more oranges out there and more people drinking oranges. Juice.
So on a test, if we were to explain what happens to the
price overall, we would just say that we're not entirely sure.
You're not
because
sure.
it was up and down.
Yep. And the way you draw it, I mean, if you're drawing these things, it's going to go one way or another. So you all may have drawn this, and the price may have stayed the same, or may have gone up, or may have gone down. But you have to recognize that's just because you happen to draw the shifts that way. You don't know.
Okay, good.
Okay, listen up for a second. You're going to have half your exam is going to be just like what you just did. There'll be other little things thrown in like who gains and who loses. So you need to see what happened to consumer surplus or producer surplus. But I'm not exaggerating. 75% of the analysis economists do, we just did for 25 or 30 minutes. And just do problems like this. The problems in your book, the problems on the handout, work together and memorize that sucker. Because that's all it is. And you're looking at you're looking at 9 things that cause shifts in these two curves and movement along two curves, and that's it. And the rest of this sort of falls out of it. So practice these, think them up. When you're reading the newspaper, think them up. Look at stuff across the dining hall. Yeah, you ought to be able to come up with dozens of examples of these things. And the thing you're going to do when you see any problem, whether it's now or 10 years from now, is you're going to say, okay, there's a change in the marketplace. Which one of these 9 things changed? That's the first question. So identify. Is this a demand side thing? Is it the price of a complement? Are these things substitutes? Is income changed? Or is this something on the supply side? Is this an input into the production of this thing? Or is it, the price of an alternative good, or is it a technology? What is this thing? Once you've identified that, then you go, okay, what's the direction of the change? Has the price of this thing gone up or down? Does that cause the shift this way? Or is this technology a good technology? Or is it a bad technology? All of a sudden, so there's a good question. All of a sudden they figure out that fracking is going to cause the northern central United States to collapse on itself. At least that's what some environmentalists would like to believe. May or may not. What happens? So all of a sudden there's a technological change. What would the technological change be? It's actually a negative technological change. We ban fracking. So we do that with chemicals. There are technological changes that work the other way. We say you can't use this. You can't use mercury anymore in all sorts of production techniques. So technological changes can move the other way. It's not common, but it happens. So you simply need, for this part of this, to be able to identify what category a particular event is falling into, and then just see what it does to your demand and supply equilibriums. And you can sort of work your way through this all the time. Okay, take a 5-minute break.
You need the markers though?
You're going back up to the board. It's interesting. I didn't do this. I didn't do this until I started doing this sort of by accident.
They always have their food down.
People actually started people who were doing other aspects. And that's literally what it's Don't go away, you're going back up with that. Melanie, were you able to get this? Okay. Did you have to buy them coffee? Okay. Do you want to wait? Sure. They haven't done it for that. It may not have been for over the last
You can tell how well it's on. It's just like. No, I don't have anything, we just.
Okay, get back up there. If you need more paper, grab more paper. Okay, do you have any questions, at least in terms of the shifts that we're talking about? And I sort of moved away from them, but not entirely. Yes, ma'am.
If we're looking at taxes and what curve they would affect, do we use the same, if the tax would be on a substituted complement, do we use the same?
Your tax questions are going to be simpler than that. The taxes we're going to do, at least for now, are always going to be on the good itself. So you're always going to shift either one of those curves by the amount of the tax. So you don't have to worry about taxes on substitutes and complements. It will, actually, it's a good question, I'll throw that on there. So it will affect other markets, because the price is going to change, right? So what was the difference? What was the... Okay. Any other questions on this part of this? You should be fairly comfortable. Don't be nervous about it. Just look at it and go, just identify it. I mean, it's like, you've got a bunch of little blocks on the ground and you have to identify what color the block is. That's about it. Okay, so let's do, we're going to look at elasticity. Okay. So this gets a little trickier. Okay, see if you can draw this. So make the assumption that we're using the straight line demand curve here, that the market for coffee beans is operating in the inelastic portion of the demand curve. So draw a straight line demand curve. No, don't draw just draw your regular old thing and make it cross in the inelastic portion of the curve. Supply curve. Now it's got it. So it's got it.
Oh, that way.
Here, look up here. There's the demand curve. And we know that beyond that point or so on the demand curve, it's inelastic demand curve, so the supply curve fits over there somewhere. That's all we're saying, is that this is unitary elasticity. This is elastic. This is unitary. And this is inelastic. And we're just saying, because that's marginal revenue. That's the high point. So this is a market question, it's a little tricky. So you want your supply curve intersecting your demand curve over to the right point. And the reason for that is, if you're in the, okay, listen up and answer this question in your head, and someone can answer it out loud. If you're operating in the inelastic portion of a demand curve, and the price rises, what happens to total revenue? Total revenue to the firm. You know this is the definition of elasticity. You better know it on Wednesday. Here we are. There's the demand curve.
Because demand's gonna say.
There's the supply curve, there's the demand curve. We're in the inelastic portion of the demand curve, which is far to the right. And that's equal to total revenue, right? In the inelastic portion of the demand curve, if you raise price, so if all of a sudden you start moving up here, what happens to the size of that rectangle? It keeps getting larger until you hit this unitary point. That's why if you're a speculator in coffee beans, you love it when half the crop of coffee beans is destroyed. It drives, there's less coffee out there. So the supply curve is cutting back, but total revenue is increasing. That's an elasticity question. And all you're looking at in terms of elasticity there is simply that in the inelastic portion of the demand curve, if the price goes up, total revenue goes up. And if price goes down, total revenue goes down. So the analysis I just gave of a coffee crop, half getting destroyed, and a lot of people are really happy about it because the prices went up. It's good if it happens to everybody. It's not good if it only happens to someone. So the same example occurs with fish. So Alaska fishermen hate it when there are big, huge bumper catches of fish. Why is that? It drives price down, and it actually drives total revenue down. So you need to go back to your notes and look at these definitions of elasticity, because a lot of this elasticity just centers around what happens to total revenue. So if you're in the, you don't even need a diagram for this, if you're in the inelastic portion of a demand curve, and the price goes up, what happens to total revenue? It goes up. Okay, if you're in the elastic portion of the demand curve and the price goes up, what happens to total revenue? It goes down. That's the whole thing, elasticity, in terms of this firm stuff. So what's the definition of price elasticity? Anybody? Percentage change in quantity over percentage change in quantity over percentage change in price. So that's your standard definition there. And some goods are more elastic than others. What makes a good more elastic than other goods? Number of substitutes is the major one.
The type of good.
Okay, fine.
The type of good.
Yeah, whether it's a generic thing, so you're looking at something like food in general, or you're looking at some narrow-based food. But really, it comes back to number of substitutes. The higher the elasticity, likely the more substitutes you have. And getting back to our earlier stuff that you've taken off, the size of those shifts or movement along a curve is determined by an elasticity. Are they close substitutes? If they're close substitutes, it's a big shift. If they're not very close substitutes, it's a small shift. Same with complements. And all you're doing is looking at sizes of elasticity in these cases.
What if it's an equal shift, though? It's like they substitute, you know, the price.
And then what happens to total revenue?
Say the same.
Stays the same. What kind of elasticity is that? Unitary. So that's, and as it turns out, I mean, to everybody's surprise, when you go measure the elasticities, an awful lot of them are pretty much unitary. I mean, they're really close to one. But when you get into particular goods, when you get into, so the things we call, things we syntax, S-I-N, not S-Y-N, syntaxes, booze, cigarettes, pot, in Nevada, prostitution, they all fall under the sin category, and they do it because it's really inelastic demand, and you can put taxes on them, and it affects the market very little. Okay, so now we'll move to the other concept of elasticity. Let's suppose so draw me two demand curves. One is relatively inelastic and one is relatively elastic. What do they look like? So one is booze and one is cereal. They gotta be different. Okay, insulin. What's the demand curve for insulin look like? Okay, the demand curve for insulin is steep, right? And when you think about it, if it's steep, all it means is that the price can change, the quantity demanded is not going to change that much. Steep. Yeah. What's the demand curve for M&Ms look like? It's relatively flat because there are lots of substitutes. Elastic goods exhibit flat demand curves. Inelastic goods generally exhibit really steep demand curves. Okay. And which do we generally tax? Inelastic. We tax the inelastic demand because when you put the tax on it, it has little effect on output. It could have it straight up, but that's unlikely. I mean, even insulin, even Ebola drugs. Someone's going to go, oh, you're going to give me $5 million for an Ebola drug that's going to cure me for sure. Someone's going to say, I'll take the $5 million and I'll take my chances. You know, so it's not perfect. Okay, so I want you to draw a demand and supply curve for cigarettes. So you have an equilibrium price and quantity for cigarettes. And then I want you to put a per unit tax on the cigarette. And tell me that there's the burden of the tax.
No, that's, oh, something, it's a cigarette.
See, I should start doing this 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, that's great though.
Although, cigarettes are a little bit
The easiest way to do
Oh, yeah, we draw another one right here, right? That's regulation, right? Supplies.
And there's, in your drawing, there's consumer loss.
I know there's a drawing where we also form.
Whenever we're doing
Okay, so, okay, that's up, look up for a second, some of you have this, some of you don't. So the easiest way to do this is start with an equilibrium, just standard market, all our problems start there, and shift up the supply curve vertically by the amount of the tax. So all you're doing is adding $1 to every one of those points on the supply curve. So the supply curve, so switch, or you can do it with demand to, do it with supply. If you've done it with demand, switch to supply, it's just easier. So shift the supply curve up parallel. And the difference between those two supply curves is the amount of the tax. You have a new equilibrium, price and quantity, and how is the burden borne? When we say there's a tax burden, what are we talking about? We're talking about loss of what? The surpluses, consumer surplus or producer surplus. And depending on how you drew this, if you drew a really, really steep demand curve, then one group gets most of the burden of the tax. If it's a really flat demand curve, the other one gets the burden of the tax. So it depends on whether it's really steep, actually in relative terms, which one's steeper. But the point here is this: when you put a tax on a good, both parties are going to bear some of the burden of the tax. Depending on the relative elasticities, for instance, if it's really inelastic demand, the demanders will bear more of the burden of the tax. If it's really inelastic supply, the suppliers will bear more of the burden of the tax. But both parties bear burdens of the tax, and the price never goes up as much as the tax. So if you put $500 luxury tax on cars are not going up $500. They're going. You can look at if this is $500, this distance, you know that the price went up less than that. And that's because people are buying less of those things. They don't go up by the whole amount. The only time it would go up by $500 is if you had perfectly inelastic supply. Okay, erase that. Or if you didn't, Okay, now I want you to draw a very inelastic demand curve. So very steep. Draw a very steep demand curve. This is good. It's not perfectly vertical, but just sort of vertical. Okay. Now put in your normal, simple supply curve so it crosses somewhere. Everything okay? Got that? You have equilibrium, price, and quantity. And now add a tax of $1. So shift the supply curve up by $1. Okay. What happens? So now, using what you just drew, describe to each other what happens to consumer surplus and producer surplus. Given the way you drew this, there's a bigger loss of consumer surplus than there is producer surplus, and you can see that. The consumer's bearing the bigger burden here. Because you see consumer surplus go down more than producer surplus goes down. And you have deadweight loss. Don't forget the deadweight loss.
Assessor?
Yes, sir.
Would it be safe to say that more
And then we would talk about.
taxes on more inelastic
Now, which one was the dead weight?
The dead weight loss is the triangle to the right.
So I think basically affects.
Consumer and producer surplus, that little tiny loss of producer surplus. So
So it'd be the one right, it'd be.
So keep in mind, this is what it is. This stuff is tax related. So this box, this thing.
Okay. Oh, okay, I see that. He said another. He said no, we have another. When it's even last. Yeah. Like the one in the last, consumers you'll usually are the downfall, but when it's a very elastic like cereal.
That's tax revenue.
Producers.
This is this is the last.
There's always consumers on top of producers. I am I was in a tennis there, so yeah. This killed a lot of people, bro. Get away from me. Yeah, so he's like, pretty bad. Yeah, but I already know. I guess sick bad was here. You study the law? Yeah.
But it definitely took me 4 or 5. Yeah, I was totally. Sure.
Okay, I have a relatively inelastic demand curve, that's the steep demand curve. I impose a tax equal to the distance between these two curves. So it's always $1 between them. All we're doing is shifting up that curve by the amount of the tax. So that causes supply to shift back. If you look at the new equilibrium, that's the quantity with the tax, that's the quantity before. Here's the old price. Everybody okay so far? Okay. What is this? That's tax revenue. It's the amount of the tax times the quantity that's in the marketplace. You got to get that point. You have to start at that point. And then you can go ahead and say, well, gee, if this is tax revenue, this is the loss in consumer surplus, and this is the loss in producer surplus. It just falls out of your diagram. So in this case, the consumers are bearing more of the burden, and there's a dead weight loss. This is the dead weight loss. Okay, and they're both bearing part of the dead weight loss as well. Did I take this from you? You were just Okay, now. Okay, heads up. Now I want you to draw a market. We'll say it's the housing rental market. And it's got a very steep supply curve. What does that mean? It's really inelastic. It doesn't respond much to changes in prices because it's hard to build properties. Very steep supply curve, relative, less steep demand curve. So make your demand curve a little flatter. Now put a tax on it. And don't put it, you down, nah, you got two demand curves there, man.
I don't mess with my man. It's all like it's going the wrong way now. It's really out
Q's usually just do.
That's right, how much is the tax? Show me how much the tax is. Vertical, that's right, it's the vertical distance between the you got. Now do the vertical. Now you're going to see the different versions here. Now who's very good?
Oh, yeah, that's,
So the cloud here like this, right?
So here's the producers.
Yeah, no,
This is actually a little bit
That's like.
We're starting with the originally delivered and used. Okay, now what happens to the tax burden? Who's got larger tax burden? Producers. The producers do because they have more inelastic supply. They're sort of in that position. There's not a lot of adjustment. They're going to bear the larger burden of the tax. And when we tax firms, we tax people, or I should say we tax goods and services, the burden's going to be borne differently depending on these elasticities. And again, depending on what we're going to do with it. So I think it's in your book, maybe in another book. Patrick Moynihan, who was one of the great senators in the middle of the 20th century, suggested that we put a $10,000 per unit tax on hollow-nosed bullets. He wasn't trying to collect revenue. What was he trying to do? He was trying to get rid of hollow-nosed bullets from the marketplace. Very inelastic demand. Very elastic demand is trying to ship everybody away and make sure nobody was buying stuff. Big tax. Okay, now. You're nervous about the test. I'm more nervous. So here's the royal question. How many people are sort of ready for this test? How many people are not? Okay, so we'll have the test on Wednesday. Okay. Okay, you're not
Wait. You have anxiety issues? More time is better.